Okay, I'm going to start, first off, to thank all of you who have been very generous in contributing to my knowledge, either by dropping off things, in particular a book on the Korean War from one of the class members. Last week, an article on bicycling the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was absolutely fascinating, I read over the weekend. Other materials. I really appreciate the willingness of many of you to recognize that I'm still learning on this, and there are many things that particularly this audience can teach me. And I was explaining to one of my graduate students how different it is to be teaching people whose experience is or who often have in-country experience on many of these issues. I also want to say I've only got 2 lectures left. I realized I'm in something of the position of the person in the famous story that you probably all heard who said, you know, I wanted to write you a short letter, but I didn't have time, and so writes a very lengthy letter. I have 3 lectures on Lyndon Johnson that I give normally. It actually usually stretches to 4 or 5. I spent a lot of time on Johnson for my book, and I tended to get a little bit caught up. And I'm going to post all those lectures. I'm going to send them to Norma. She'll have them. They'll be there. You're welcome to look. But I'm going to speed through some things at various points today. And I want to apologize for that. I just have not been able to consolidate it down to one lecture. And I want to be able to talk next week about Nixon and the sort of the end of the war and give that enough time. So it's going to be a little tricky. Last week, you'll recall that I was able to tell you a start with that, talking about the transition which Johnson faced with Kennedy's assassination, play you a couple of recordings from that early period, one in which Johnson rather graphically discussed how difficult it is for Democrats to run if they're being connected to a sympathy for the communists in any way, that Johnson was always very sensitive to the charge of soft on communism, even as he was trying to take measures that would ease the Cold War. So I wanted you to at least hear him say that. The other one was the discussion with Sergeant Shriver about his own views of the Ziem assassination and his sense that this had been a terrible mistake. But he, of course, was cut out of the loop, as we would say later. We didn't use that phrase at the time, but he was not in the loop that made the decisions that led to the overthrow and assassination of No Din Siem. But he inherited, of course, the aftermath of that. Some of you came up afterwards to tell me a few Lyndon Johnson stories. Lyndon Johnson stories abound. Not all of them put him in a very favorable light. In fact, there are many stories that put him in a very unfavorable light. I think he was a complicated, difficult man at times. He also had his good side. He had his very generous, in some sense, side. He had also, I think, his historical contribution to the overcoming of racism and apartheid in America is still something that cannot be taken away from Lyndon Johnson and needs to be recognized. But he was a complicated man. I had a chance to go down to the Johnson Library a number of times when I was doing the work, and I met the director of that library, Harry Middleton. And there's a famous story about Harry Middleton that when he was at Lyndon Johnson's funeral, when people were filing past the casket, and Johnson died about 40 years ago this last week, I think it was January 23rd or so. When people were filing by, Harry Middleton had a clicker and was counting the number of people who were filing by. Someone asked, you know, why are you doing that? And Middleton replied, I just know somewhere, sometime, Lyndon's going to want to know. And there's something to that about Johnson. His obsessiveness about public support, all sorts of things, his desire to be all things to all people, to win an overwhelming mandate. There's a complicated psychology. But I think I'd also warn you, though, not to put all of the Vietnam War onto Lyndon Johnson's shoulders, although I know that that's a tendency people have. We want to identify presidents in that way, whether good or bad, without recognizing sometimes that they are responding to circumstances and conditions beyond their control. Nevertheless, what I'm going to try to do today in trying to talk about Johnson and his war, and it was LBJ's war and became his war, is try to give you in abbreviated terms is what I try to tell my students. Namely, I see Johnson's decision to escalate in this first bit I'll present to you as a complicated gamble. A gamble that weighed foreign policy and domestic concerns, and that was launched with the hope that the use of force could be calibrated in such a way as to bring about a solution to the Vietnam problem without the destruction or the frustration of his domestic and other foreign policy objectives, that he believed he could get a deal at some point with his enemy, as he had often in his political life. It was a complicated gamble, and he lost. And the second part will be looking at the stalemate that developed in Vietnam from 1965 to 67 as the United States escalated and prevented the loss of South Vietnam, but was unable to achieve any decisive military superiority. Johnson, at that time, launched a progress offensive. He wanted Americans to believe that we were making progress in Vietnam, and that progress offensive would be decisively challenged by the Tet Offensive, which is the third part of what I want to narrate today, namely the enemy's boldness in launching a countrywide offensive. Almost, now it would be 45 years ago this month, the Tet Offensive would challenge Johnson's claims and destroy the political support within the United States for the continuation of the war, and ultimately lead him to decide not to run for re-election. That's going to be, I tell my students, I have this awful tendency as well in my classes sometimes to have too much in there and feel like I'm not going to make it to the end, so I tell them that one of my favorite romantic comedies is When Harry Met Sally. And at the beginning of that, the Billy Crystal Harry character tells the Meg Ryan character that he has a dark side, and his dark side is he always reads the last pages of a book when he buys it, just in case he dies before he finishes it. So the dark side of my lectures, I'm going to tell you where I hope to end up, and then try to build toward it today. And that's my goal today, to do that. And I'll start out with just reminding you where I was last week. As I said, the domestic politics of foreign policy. Johnson wanted to be seen as continuing Kennedy's legacy, but he was faced with a difficult situation in Vietnam that began to deteriorate. As you remember, if you recall the conversation with Shriver and all these links, all you have to do is click on them and to hear these tapes and that. So if you want to refresh your memory or listen to ones that I don't play, please go ahead. And if you have any problems, please let me know and I'll try to find that if the link has expired. I've checked most of them though, and they're still there. In early '64, if you think about Johnson's dilemmas as a politician, he has inherited the presidency from Jack Kennedy. Kennedy has become an American icon and hero within a matter of weeks. It's an extraordinarily sensitive situation. He wants to be seen as carrying out his legacy and policies. That's not always clear what Kennedy intended, but Johnson's first priority was to try to get Kennedy's legislative programs through, and that's what he spends most of his time on. And he does, and he's extraordinarily successful. And any of you who have picked up the Caro, the latest part of the Robert Caro biography, will read how Johnson was able to get Kennedy's various measures through. And in November of 1963, a book was published that was basically saying that it was impossible. The American system didn't work anymore. Congress was frustrated. Nothing was working, similar to what we sometimes think today. And they were saying that. And here's Johnson using his skills, his ideas, his ability to bargain, the political atmosphere of the country. Here's Johnson getting this legislation passed. And that's what he devotes himself to. Vietnam is on the back burner, but it's there. I played something of Johnson's treatment with that. You might recall, the famous Johnson gallbladder showing his scar. People sometimes think of that as sort of the height of Johnson's vulgarity, but in fact, one of the reasons he did that was because rumors had spread throughout the country that he had another bad, serious heart attack, and he wanted to convince people, no, it was really gallbladder surgery after all. Of course, this was changed later, as you might recall, became one of the more famous political cartoons from the 60s, in the New York Review of Books with South Vietnam, the scar there. But in 1964, what Johnson faced was a political situation in Vietnam that was rapidly deteriorating. The coup against Diem set off a political battle among generals. One of the generals in that, I just noticed, died this past month, Nowin War. He overturned the first junta, and he ultimately would end up in exile in the United States. The overthrow of Khan was another one. There's a deteriorating military situation that also enhanced. And as I mentioned last time, the North Vietnamese decided to take advantage of this option to begin to fortify both the Viet Cong, who were the South Vietnamese who fought in the army, but also sending now North Vietnamese regular armed forces into the South with the goal of trying to overthrow and defeat the government before the United States reacts. They benefited at this time by what was the radical state of the Chinese Communist Party, which supported People's War. I mentioned to you last time that at the beginning of the 60s, it looked like Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviets were the ones who were backing People's Wars and insurgencies and all of the rest. Khrushchev pulled away from that after the Cuban Missile Crisis. He got religion, you might say, and for a Marxist it might sound a little strange, but he got a sense of the danger that came from Soviet backing and pulled back. But the Chinese, of course, who were rivals to him in the communist world, they intensified their support. And they pushed back hard against the Soviet Union's peaceful coexistence line. And particularly in Asia, they seem to be wanting to expand. You know, in more recent times, many of you probably, you read the papers, you know that there has been concern about Chinese military buildup, and Asian powers such as Japan and the Philippines have asked for more, you might say, American support. But this was certainly the situation in 1964 was the sense that Chinese communism was on the march, that China was supporting insurgencies in Malaysia and Thailand, in Vietnam, that it had an ally in Indonesia and the leader there, Sukarno. So that vulnerability, that sense that the United States was facing a real challenge was certainly there. Let me play you here, just as LBJ talks to McNamara about it. You get a sense of how he perceived this situation at the time.
About the need for a Vietnam speech. We prepared such a speech, and Dean and I discussed the desirability of my giving it next Thursday night. I have to make a speech here in Washington at that time. I sent a draft over to your office last night to Mike Forrestal, who was going to give it to you.
He hadn't given it to me. I'll get it from him, read it over the weekend. I think it's good. I think if you could, that you ought to go up and sit down with Greening and Morris.
Well, I think I should, and I think...
What I do is ask Mansfield, just say, now, I don't want to debate, I don't want to argue, I don't want to convince anybody, but I would like for them to know my viewpoint, and I'm going to make this speech, and the President asked me to ask you if you'd get Morris and Greening in your office and let me visit with them a little bit about it.
Very good, I'll do that. I've got to make the speech Thursday night, and I'll do that before I do it Thursday.
I'll get it over the weekend. You going to be at home weekend?
Yes, sir, I will. I think I can take a lot of the heat off of you on this Vietnam issue, Mr. President. There's just a lot of misunderstanding on it in this country, and that's the real purpose for it.
Now, what are we going to do? We're going to do more of the same, except we're going to firm it up and strengthen it, and what else?
Well, it's really
what is a one-sentence statement?
Our policy is to help Khan provide the physical security and the economic and social progress for his people that he needs in order to gain their support.
All right, but that's what we've been doing.
Well, we haven't done it very effectively, and neither have they.
Why aren't the Russians as interested in this as we are? Why aren't the French and the English? Why do they want the communists to take over all Southeast Asia?
Well, I think the French are obviously pursuing their own national aims, and they think that we're going to lose out there anyhow, and they might as well advance their national strength and prestige while we're losing.
Looks like to me that the Russians would be more interested in saving Vietnam than we are.
Well, you can't be sure what their position is. I think we...
Doesn't that seem logical to you? If they're in a war with them, and they got a civil war going on between 800 million Chinese and the Russians, why do they want to see the Chinese communists envelop Southeast Asia?
I think the reason that they can't take a strong position against the Chinese communists here is that to do so will lose them the support of communist parties elsewhere in the world. I think the Soviets are...
I thought they just thought we had an umbrella over them like de Gaulle does. Thought we do it, and they didn't need it or anything.
I don't think so. I think they are in a very sensitive position for control of communist parties worldwide. And if they appear to be soft opposing us in Vietnam, they'll be charged with that and lose control. In any event, I've tried to prepare a strong statement here of what we're doing, why we're doing it, what the prospects are.
All right. What can I say to the press? They're going to come in after a while and just visit with me. And you got something starving over in your shop?
If you want to, you might say that you've continued to emphasize, particularly the Defense Department, which has such a high percentage of the federal budget, the need for increasing our strength, while doing so to reduce costs by increasing efficiency, and that you understand that we will have some further announcements to make on that subject in the next couple of weeks. It looks as though, Mr. President, we could bring to you a package of base closings which don't appear to be too difficult politically, that would bring in savings of something on the order of 60, 70 million a year.
I stop it there, but what's interesting, of course, is in 1964, even as they're talking about Vietnam, McNamara was closing bases. They were actually cutting the budget of the Defense Department because Johnson was determined to get a budget under $100 billion that year. Chicken feed these days, I guess. But you got in that Johnson sort of probing McNamara, asking some questions, this sort of thing. But, you know, it's clear that he's still fairly uncertain where things are going on Vietnam. I can't really play this whole conversation, but if some of you want to hear some of the Johnson treatment on Richard Russell again, you'll get it in this particular one. I'll leave it in the links. What I want to stress is my view of how Johnson's concerns were. I can't play all the tapes, but I think Johnson does have an ambitious domestic program that he's seeking to get past. It's to complete the New Deal. He wants a war on poverty. He wants the Civil Rights Act. Ultimately, he will push for a Voting Rights Act. He talks to Hubert Humphrey about this in this one conversation, and you hear Johnson talking about, we've got ideas, and it's this sort of enthusiasm for carrying out the Roosevelt platform. And you have to keep in mind that Lyndon Johnson's great political hero is Franklin Roosevelt, and he wants, in that sense, to complete what he sees Roosevelt's revolution was about. At the same time, he doesn't want to take any action until the election in Vietnam. He wants, in a sense, a continuity with Kennedy's policy, but on the other hand, he also doesn't want a situation in which we have to take action. I'm going to play this one. This is a brief one with Bundy, which captures some of it. And you get a little bit of an idea of his relationship with McGeorge Bundy, who is Kennedy's holdover as National Security Advisor. This is around the same time as McNamara's speech, or McNamara's discussion, all in March of '64. I'm just going to play part one, but you'll get a flavor of it, I think, here.
And third, Mr. President, I've got a lunch with Joe Allsup. You got any messages?
Allsup was a columnist.
No, except
To stay away from Vietnam. I think he really wants to have a little war out there. And,
well, I'd ask him what his program is. I'd ask him if he wants to send people in there and start North Korea. He didn't say the other day in his column. He just said that it's really going to wreck me. But I'd like to tell him we'd like to have his recommendation.
what is your own internal thinking on this, Mr. President, that we've just got to stick on this middle course as long as there's any possible hope? And
I just can't believe that we can't take 15,000 advisors and 200,000 people.
He's referring to Vietnamese troops there.
Maintain the status quo for 6 months. I just believe we can do that if we do it right. Now, I don't know enough about it to to know. That's what I don't.
The only thing that scares me is that the government would up and quit on us, or that there'd be a coup.
There may be another coup,
yeah.
but I don't know what we can do. If there is, I guess we just what alternatives do we have then? We're not going to send our troops in there, are we?
Yeah. You'll hear. Let me play part two. This is March of 1964.
The one thing that I think you might find that I think Bob ought at least to look at is whether a stiffener in the sense of another couple of thousand people would have the cycle. It's not because they needed to win the war, but only because they needed to show that we think this damn thing can be done. I think there is a problem not of that is essentially a state of mind problem, and that action can affect that. For example, it may turn out that we want to add to those planes we sent into Thailand the other day a battalion to go have a watching brief in Thailand of Marines. We did that once before, and it had quite a striking effect. We got it on a little later on. These are things that we've got to go over the checklist of with McNamara and get your sense of what the costs and values are before he goes, so that he has a complete picture of the possible choices.
Why don't you make up all that? Why don't you get anybody else that you think has got any fresh ideas or new ones? And I'd ask you what he reckons.
I will. I'll just say we're at the listening stage, and you tell me, because I don't want to give him anything to bite on that area at the moment. He incidentally is all cheered up because he was very wary of Hillsman and thinks that this is Bill's going in there as in itself a sort of solution to the problem. It's not. No one man is going to solve a headache like this one.
No, but if we can keep him aboard, and he ought to be aboard, but his 2 or 3 columns haven't helped us any.
No. Well, I think he meant them to be helpful because he honestly thinks this damn thing's about to come apart.
His first column was not at all. Okay.
You get an idea here of presidents paying attention to columnists. Joe Allsup was a very prominent Washington Post columnist at the time, considered something of a hawk on Vietnam, but was warning Johnson the situation was coming apart. Allsup was right in that sense. He had good sources. He knew how bad the situation was going in Vietnam. Johnson, though, didn't want to do anything yet. Yeah.
Why does it always sound like these guys didn't live through the 50s and have any knowledge of the French occupation? It's almost like they're...
Well, you got a little bit of a sense of that from McNamara. You know, the French are pursuing their national interests. They think we're going to lose anyway. But you got to remember, after all, the French tried to build the Panama Canal. They failed. We built it. There's this sense. They fell in World War II. We rescued them. There was this hubris, is the only way to describe it, which basically said the French, without using the terms that were more recently used about them during the Iraq War, the French can't do it. They're more interested in surrender. They'll you know, that sort of thing. And I think that sense, the irritation with the French was such, with de Gaulle particularly at that time, was such that we weren't listening to them. And that's one of the sort of sadder things I think about de Gaulle. I have a sort of my sense de Gaulle was pursuing his own ends for nationalist reasons. He saw in irritating the United States the quickest way to get lots of support in France. The net result of that was, though, that neither side was talking to the other in any real way, and we did fail to benefit from what you might have said would have been French advice and thought on it. No question on that. They did live through the 50s in another sense, and let me make this point. What Johnson is thinking about, and you got from Bundy this notion of you want a little old war out there, something like Korea. And that's what Johnson's real fear is, something like Korea is going to break out. And in one of the conversations that I want to play this one because it's relatively famous. It's a little more lengthy and it's cut up a bit, but it's been played a number of times. And when it was first released, many people, it was on the media a lot because it captures something of Johnson's real doubts about the war. Johnson feared that he was going to get in a situation like Korea. And what he meant by that was he feared a confrontation with communist China. He feared the Chinese would come in, that the United States would be faced with a land war in Asia, that it could not win, that this would escalate, that this was the danger he faced. And in May of 1964, about 2 months after the conversations you've just heard, there's been some escalation of conflict. A plane was downed in Laos. There's been sort of talk. Johnson is still focused on the domestic issues. Johnson is still directed there, but he's worrying more now about Vietnam. He's worrying more about what he needs to do. So he calls his old friend, Richard Russell. And Richard Russell, some of you know if you're from Georgia, is a very prominent senator. Probably would have been president of the United States if he hadn't been a segregationist. He was a smart guy, but he was stuck in sort of a time warp on that, and he maintained his opposition to all the civil rights proposals. But he was knowledgeable on foreign affairs, and Johnson trusted him. He had been a mentor to Johnson. Johnson calls him up, and here's their conversation. And I think you'll get a sense of the Korea issue. You'll also get a sense of Richard Russell's wisdom, I think, in some of this as well.
Hello?
Pretty good, how you, Mr. President? Oh, got lots of trouble. I want to see what we all have those. What do you think about this Vietnam thing? I'd like to hear you talk a little bit.
Well, frankly, Mr. President, if you would tell me that I was authorized to settle it as I saw fit, I would respectfully decline to undertake it. It's a damn worst mess I ever saw, and I don't like to brag. I never have been right any time in my life, but I knew we were going to get in this sort of mess when we went in there, and I don't see how we're going to ever get out without fighting a major war with the Chinese and all of them down there in those rice paddies and jungles. I just don't see it. I just don't know what to do.
Well, that's the way I've been feeling for 6 months.
Our position is deteriorating, and it looks like the more we try to do for them, the less they're willing to do for themselves. It's just a sad situation. There's no sense of responsibility there on the part of any of their leaders, apparently. It's all just through generations or even centuries they have just thought about the individual and glorifying the individual. That's the only utilization of power, just glorify the individual, not save the state or to help other people. And they just can't shed themselves of that complex. It's a hell of a situation. It's a mess. It's going to get worse, and I don't know what to do. I don't think the American people were quite ready for us to send our troops in there to fight. And if it came down to an option of just sending Americans in there to do the fighting, which will, of course, eventuate into a ground war and a conventional war with China, and we do them a favor every time we kill it. Cooley, whereas one of our people got killed, it'd be a loss to us. If it got down to that, just pulling out, I'd get out. But then I don't know. There's undoubtedly some middle ground somewhere. If I was going to get out, I'd get the same guy that got rid of old Dean to get rid of these people and get some fellow in there that said he wished the hell we would get out. I see no terminal date for any part of that.
How important is it to us?
It isn't important to them yet. Well, I don't know. We double the ticket right now. And we should look pretty good, I guess, going in there with all the troops and sending them all in there. But I tell you, it'll be the most expensive venture this country ever went into.
I've got a little old sergeant who works for me over to a house, and he got 6 children. And I just put him up as the United States Army and Air Force and Navy every time I think about making this decision and think about sending that father to those 6 kids in there. And what the hell are we going to get out of his doing it? And it just makes the chills run up my back. I've got nerve to do it, and I don't see any other way out of it.
What sense to do it? That's one of these things where Hitler wins if you lose.
Well, thank you, Larry, and I'll talk to you again. I hate to bother you, but I'm just...
God knows I do, because it's a terrific quandary that we in over there. We just in the quicksands up there very next. I just don't know how to let the hell the best way to do about it.
I love you, and I'll be talking.
I see you.
Many people, I think, were struck when they heard that Johnson had such doubts about what he was going to do. I think the idea that presidents don't always sort of take charge and make 100% decisions sometimes bothers people, especially when you're talking about something as important as war and peace. But as one of the presidential advisors put it to me, you know, the difficult decisions, they don't, or the easy decisions, the 100% ones don't get to the president. They're decided at lower levels. It's the ones that are 51-49. It's the ones that are really close calls that get to the president, and then he has to make a decision and then present it like it's 100%, like it's something that we just have to do. And Johnson would do that, and Johnson will do that, and that will give many people a sense of that he somehow didn't recognize some of the dangers that existed in taking the course of action he did. Johnson, during this time, around this time, begins drawing up a resolution of support that he wants to get from the Congress for the war. He doesn't submit it because he wants to get the Civil Rights Bill first through. He's delaying it. And then comes the Gulf of Tonkin incident here in Vietnam. I can't play all the different tapes on the, yes?
Don't you think Obama might be in the same situation that Johnson was, but he's too arrogant to ask anybody's advice?
I don't want to get political, please. Okay, you have your point of view. Presidents give off manners. I mean, back in the 60s, many people thought Lyndon Johnson was the same way. They basically thought presidents have images that they create. Whether they are or not, it takes years later to find out. And, you know, in fact, I think many of us have revised our views on Lyndon Johnson from hearing the tapes. Unfortunately, because of Richard Nixon, we're not going to get tapes of other presidents. But, you know, that you do get records. You do see how presidents seek out advice. You do see what they say behind the scenes as opposed to what they say on camera and for their supporters. All I'll say is the jury should be out for the time being on contemporary ones, but I do think presidents face this dilemma. There is a way in which Barack Obama is similar to Lyndon Johnson, in that as a Democratic president, he does face the challenge of being seen as soft on security. This has been a continuing motif in American politics, and that the choice of military force will not be popular with his supporters and will be the last resort that he will take. And he faces positions like that in Iran, where Iran recently now said it's not going to talk to the United States on nuclear weapons. How do you go about it? Do you continue diplomacy? This was something of the same thing. These types of dilemmas face presidents. Johnson was faced with it. He drew up, as I say, this resolution of support, and then the Gulf of Tonkin incident happened. And I want to just take a moment to say something about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, because, of course, it has an image. Let me show you quickly the image that's sometimes presented. The modern-day comparison. Declassified documents show that LBJ went to war based on lies. It's an old Texas tradition. This was sorted out after the WMD fiasco with the Iraq War, this idea that Johnson, this was a lie. In fact, of course, the Gulf of Tonkin incident is complicated. There was an attack. There was an attack. There was one attack. There was not a second attack. And the way the complication comes in is that there was a first attack on American ships August 2nd, 1964. But it was connected to covert operations that were going on. The North Vietnamese undoubtedly thought the American ships were connected to what were raids that were being carried out by South Vietnamese forces. I mentioned to you last time that Kennedy had approved these. That was an attempt to stop and to deal with the North Vietnamese. The Americans knew the North Vietnamese were sending troops. They knew the role of the North Vietnamese in carrying out the insurgency, and they were trying to do something about it. But they obviously weren't going to do something that was very politically sensitive. And by that I mean they weren't going to do something that might occasion fears of escalation in a Korea-like outbreak of war. So they were doing covert operations. Johnson issues a warning after the first attack. And then the Second attack, word comes back that there might be a second attack. This was often seen to be a sonar operator's enthusiastic or sort of thinking that torpedoes in a situation where they weren't able to see in the dark of night out in the Gulf of Tonkin. It may have been delayed intelligence coming back. There's a whole sort of cottage industries of what happened there. What I think happened is Johnson worries that word of the second attack will come back, and that if he does not respond quickly and rapidly, it will turn into a political issue. So even before the second attack is confirmed, Johnson orders a bombing raid on North Vietnam, and then will ask for congressional support against what's called an unprovoked attack. And I think if there's any aspect of deception that comes into the way the administration, it's calling it unprovoked. And Johnson knows that there have been what could be considered by Americans provocations of North Vietnam. He thinks they're justified because he thinks North Vietnam is, of course, carrying out a war there. But he is angry about it, and he's particularly angry when his soon-to-be vice president says some of these things to the public. And I'll play you a tape that's just fascinating for the Johnson-Humphrey relationship, but also captures Johnson's own annoyance that Humphrey's sort of straying from the message the administration wanted to convey.
I don't know. I don't know how to get this message over, but this boy, our friend Hubert, is just destroying himself with his big mouth. Yeah, all the time, and he just can't stop it. He's just got hydrophobia, and every responsible person gets frightened when they see him. He hasn't missed any program where he's just like a wild man when he kind of sees this thing in the distance. And what he ought to do is be very retiring and very sober and very judicious and fella. Now, yesterday morning, he went on the TV, and it looks like he's got by with it, but he said everybody in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, every person in town that's handling war plans, it just scared them to death, because he just blabbed everything that he had heard in a briefing, just like it was his personal knowledge. And almost wanted to claim credit for it. They said, for instance, how would you account for these pitiable attack on our destroyers when we innocently out there in the Gulf 60 miles from shore? And McNamara said that that's a very difficult thing to explain the reasoning of these people. It may be that they wanted to try to scare us out of the area, but that he couldn't explain communist thinking on a good many matters. Rusk said substantially the same thing. Humphrey said, well, we have been carrying on some operations in that area. And we've been having some covert operations where we have been going in and knocking out roads and petroleum things and so forth. And that's exactly what we have been doing. But the damn fool got it up, and now he's got Morse talking about it, who wasn't in on the briefing. And it's just, you just got to understand that you can't talk about war plans. You just can't talk about it. Now, this morning, this morning, that fellow called me very upset, one of the highest officials in the government, and said, have you talked to Humphrey about a communication from Khrushchev? And I said, no. I haven't seen Humphrey, haven't seen anybody around Humphrey, haven't talked to my wife, haven't talked to a human being. Well, Humphrey has discussed the details of communications with Khrushchev that somebody must have let him know about, and with a correspondent for NBC. And it's the one thing that could make Khrushchev drop a bomb on us. And he just ought to keep his goddamn big mouth shut on foreign affairs, at least until the election's over. And just say that this has just got people running wild, and they're running in every moment to me. And for him not to be speculating on why the communists would be doing something.
You could see it was going to be a difficult relationship when Hubert Humphrey was Johnson's vice president. He would take a lot of this. There's a wonderful tape of Johnson offering it to Humphrey and basically saying, you know, this is like a marriage. You have to, and you get an idea how Johnson saw marriage. But he basically was saying to Hubert, you better understand you've got to do what you've got to toe the line. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, of course, passes 416 to none in the House and 88 to 2 in the Senate, one of the dissenting voters being indeed that Oregon Senator Morris, who was raising questions about American behavior. The problem is that even with the resolution and the bombing, there's just more chaos in South Vietnam. There's another coup. Yes?
What exactly was the content of the resolution?
The resolution indicated that the Congress of the United States fully supports every and all efforts. I should actually, very good question, I should actually have the exact wording. LBJ used to say it was like grandma's nightshirt, it covered everything. And the idea was that it would become the full legal authority for undertaking military operations in Vietnam. And it covered all efforts to resist armed aggression by the communists in Vietnam, and it was a full-scale expression of congressional support. But chaos ensued. But the political aspect, and this is important, the political aspect of the issue of Vietnam fades. Barry Goldwater, who had brought it up and brought up the weakness of the Johnson administration on communism, now de-emphasizes that for an attack that's mostly on domestic policy. Although Goldwater still does come up with some issues. Many of you, of course, recall this, and I have to show it because, of course, it's, let me... It's only shown once, and maybe not. I don't know where it is. I don't know where it is here. I don't know. I lost it here. For whatever reason, it doesn't seem to have come up. Anyway, I can actually access it in a different way. Let me just do that quickly. And let me go to the living room candidate, the ads, and that'll allow me to do that.
These are the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
Johnson's great worry was apathy among the Democrats, that they were so far ahead that his voters might stay home. If you think, though, Barry Goldwater did run very much the sort of anti-communist and weakness type ad. This is my favorite of his on that. But
hand over your heart. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
Оглядывайтесь, мы вас не добили под Сталинградом, а Украине, Беларуси.
For which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible.
Против нас и будете опять готовить нападение, мы так ухнем.
Justice for all.
I want American kids to grow up as Americans, and they will, if we have the guts to make our intentions clear. So clear they don't need translation or interpretation, just respect for a country prepared as no country in all history ever was.
In your heart, you know he's right. Vote for Barry Goldwater.
that ad had the unfortunate circumstance of coming out only a day or two before Khrushchev was overthrown in the Kremlin, and so it wasn't as effective, even if it had problems in the first place. Goldwater's campaign, I think, though, gave Johnson a sense of what his political opposition was. Johnson, as you know, was the peace candidate. He said a number of things about Vietnam that later would come back to haunt him, that he didn't want to send American boys to fight a war that Asian boys should fight. But he also said he wouldn't allow countries to fall to communism. In a sense, he had done the same thing that I told you President Kennedy had done, of saying on the one hand he believed in the domino theory, but on the other hand it was still the Vietnamese' war to win or to lose. Goldwater did make one Vietnam ad, and it's always fascinating to me to watch it. Let's see.
I'm Raymond Massey, and this is what really gets me. This is a picture of a dead American soldier shot by the Viet Cong guerrilla in Vietnam. What's our government doing about it? And the 275 other dead Americans? Nothing, not a thing, because we are fighting a no-win war in Vietnam, a war we don't want to win. Well, as an American, I don't like it. I don't like our policy, and I don't like no-win wars, especially wars our men are getting butchered in. Don't you want to stop this war? Don't you care about what's happening over there? Well, I care a lot. That's why I'm voting for Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater doesn't want to fight wars. Barry Goldwater wants to put a stop to that mess in Vietnam. That mess that's killing our men. That mess that's costing us $1 million a day. I'm going to vote for Barry Goldwater, and I urge you to do the same. Vote for a real American. Vote for Barry Goldwater. In your heart, you know he's right.
You could see, in a way, even though this didn't have a great deal of resonance, there was already this sort of sense, the critique developing. This is a no-win war. It's amazing when I listen to that, 275 Americans, that was all that the casualties were at that time. And it was still this notion of a no-win war, and Goldwater ran with that as an issue. Of course, Johnson played on the idea that Goldwater was reckless and crazy about nuclear weapons. The Democrats took the slogan that Goldwater used, "In your heart, you know he's right," to "in your guts, you know he's nuts." And they turned that against Goldwater, and these results give you some idea of what a sweeping landslide it was. 60% more. Johnson had bested Franklin Roosevelt, but he also brought in a Democratic Congress. Johnson's landslide, and this will be a difference with Nixon's only 8 years later, was an enormous landslide for the Democratic Party and produced the most liberal Congress since Roosevelt's since the 1930s. And Johnson was determined to use that. Okay, I am running out of time, so I'm going to have to abbreviate some of what I want to say. In effect, Johnson gained the political mandate he wanted for the social programs he was determined to bring out. My argument would be that Johnson believed he had a minimum amount of time before opposition would set in order to enact his legislative agenda, and he was determined to carry that out through. The problem was that in that minimum time, the crisis in Vietnam reached an absolute boiling point, in the sense that I think, and I think this is disputed, everything I say, I should say, is contested, but I think at this point it became clear that the South Vietnamese government would not survive, and that the United States either had to intervene to prevent its fall or to get out. I think Johnson, in this sense, faced a choice that Kennedy had been able to postpone, that Johnson had been able to postpone. But that the North Vietnamese, by this point, were determined to get victory, and Johnson had to face and make a choice as to what to do. The Pleiku incident happens early on because the North Vietnamese are trying to cut the country in half by taking the Central Highlands. They attack a Marine base, Pleiku. Johnson orders the bombing of Vietnam, bombing of North Vietnam on a regular basis. The bombing raids, and again, the Gulf of Tonkin was a one-on deal and was over. But now Johnson orders a regular bombing of North Vietnam. I think in this, Johnson is still hoping that he can get some sort of an agreement by the North Vietnamese. Now, historians really dispute this point. They think Johnson has decided by this point that he wants to go full-on for war. I think it's more complicated. I think he's hoping that perhaps the use of force similar to the way Kennedy seemed to up the ante in the Cuban Missile Crisis with a blockade, would lead the North Vietnamese to recognize that he would continue to escalate. He believed that gradualism, in this sense, would send a political signal. This would later be something military people particularly would find very difficult to stomach, because the gradualism, they said, in effect, reduces the effectiveness of military force. But Johnson believed gradualism, in this sense, would send the political signal that might get an agreement before he had to go to full escalation. The Marines, though, land in March of '65. Russell continues to tell Johnson what a mess it is. Johnson gives a major speech in April of '65, defending the war, talking about why we're in South Vietnam, connecting it to the whole range of American history and the defense of freedom. In effect, he even promises Ho Chi Minh a development program in the Mekong Delta that would parallel the Tennessee Valley Authority. This comes into accusations, but it's fascinating that in more recent times, the Vietnamese and Americans have actually talked about the same type of thing. So it's odd. Johnson was trying, in a sense, to bribe Ho Chi Minh and try basically a $1 billion development program if you stop fighting. It didn't work. It is important, I think, to recognize that Johnson is also faced with a domestic crisis at this time. He's faced with a crisis that is intensifying over civil rights issues. The March on Selma takes place in March of '65. He proposes the Voting Rights Act. He sees he has a window of opportunity for the domestic legislation, Medicare, aid to education, but you also have an extraordinary outbreak of domestic violence during this period. The riots in Watts, riots in other places in 1965, riots which will continue for every summer up till 1968. In that sense, Johnson believes that he's facing a domestic crisis and a foreign crisis, and ultimately will make a decision, I would argue, that he hopes will be something of a compromise. He tells McNamara that we didn't want to do this on a limb by ourselves, but Johnson, in effect, decides on something of a middle way. He's not going to do what the Pentagon and McNamara proposed, namely a full mobilization of American military strength. He doesn't want to impose taxes. He doesn't want to call up the National Guard as Kennedy had done in the Berlin crisis. He's going to rely on the draft, in a sense, as the politically least damaging way to escalate a war and to send more Americans to Vietnam. It will, of course, prove to be not that. I simply put this in to give you some idea of the demographics. The problem was the draft offered a huge pool of manpower, but of course it had a decentralized structure that opened up all sorts of possibilities for deferments and abuse and inequality, and that would ultimately become one of the things that would become focused on. But let me play, finally, this as Johnson tries to explain why he has chosen what he's chosen. An in-between policy of gradually escalating the number of Americans in Vietnam, of bombing North Vietnam, of trying to do what he sees as a mean, as he tries to explain this to Martin Luther King, who's skeptical of Johnson's approach. So let me just play this. Let's see if I can find the mouse. Here we go.
I'm trying to do my best to, I've lost about 264 lives up to now, and I could lose 265,000 mighty easy, and I'm trying to keep those zeros down and at the same time not trigger a conflagration that would be worse. If we pulled out, I can't stay there and do nothing unless I bomb. They run me out right quick. That's the only pressure we have. And if they'll quit bombing, if they'll quit coming in, if they'll quit tearing up our roads and our highways and quit taking over our camps, bombing our planes and destroying them, well, we'll quit the next day. They'll just leave the folks alone, but they won't do it. So the only pressure we can put on is to try to hold them back as much as we can by taking their bridges out, delaying them, by taking out their ammunition dumps and destroying them, by taking out their radar stations, permit them to shoot down our planes. Now, that's what we've been doing. A good many people, including the military, think that's not near enough. I want to do a lot more. And I've tried to keep it to that so I won't escalate it and get into trouble with China and with Russia, and I don't want to be a war monger. At the same time, if I didn't do that, I'd stayed as long as I could the other way. I held up till February. After I came in November, I went from November to November, from November to February. But they kept coming. They just kept coming, and I couldn't stand it longer. I had to get out and do it. Now I'm doing it with a restraint and with the best judgment that I know how. If I pulled out, I think that our commitments would be no good anywhere. I think it would immediately trigger a situation in Thailand. It would be just as bad as it is in Vietnam. I think we'd be right back to the Philippines with problems. I think the Germans would be scared to death. Their commitment to them was no good. And God knows what we'd have other places in the world. I think it's the situation we had in Lebanon. I think it's the situation we had in Formosa. I think it's the situation we had in Greece, Turkey, and Iran, and Truman and Eisenhower. None of these people allowed them to go in and take these people's freedom away from them. And I'm trying. I didn't get us into this. We got into it in 54. Eisenhower and Kennedy were in it deep. They had 33,000 men out there when I came in the presidency. Now, I don't want to pull down the flag and come home running with my tail between my legs, particularly if it's going to create more problems than I got out there. And it would, according to all of our best judges. On the other hand, I don't want to get us more with China and Russia. So I've got a pretty tough problem, man. I'm not all wise. I pray every night to get direction and judgment and leadership that permit me to do what's right.
In a sense, he's explaining that to King, who he knows is more skeptical, and you can see the logic, though, of escalation. Johnson enjoyed, for the most part, support from the American people for the initial decisions. There was a rally around the flag effect, but there were also already protests against the war. In April of '65, SDS has a major protest. Morley Safer, famous Cam Nee video is played at this time. You already have skepticism. As long as I'm not going to make it today to everything I want, maybe I'll play the Cam Nee one because it's really well worth taking a look at it. This is not from our TV archive because it was done in August of '65. So Johnson makes the decisions to escalate. He does it as a speech in July of '65, says we're going to protect Vietnam. It's part of this overwhelming Cold War commitment. About a week later, this video shows up on CBS News. And here Safer is commenting on it as well.
But in the summer of 1965, 33-year-old CBS correspondent Morley Safer filed what would become one of the most controversial television reports of the war. Early on the morning of August 3rd, he had been invited to join a search and destroy operation at a suspected Viet Cong stronghold south of Da Nang.
I talked to a captain, tried to get some idea of what the operation was about, and he said, well, we got orders to take this complex of villages called Cam Nee. And I never heard anything like that. He said to take out this complex of villages. And I thought perhaps he's exaggerating. We got in, the troops walked across towards this village. And started torching every house that I could see as far as I could see.
This is what the war in Vietnam is all about. Below the very north, the Marines have burned this old couple's cottage because fire was coming from here.
The trooper with the flamethrower was ordered to zap a particular house, and Vietnamese cameraman put his camera down and said, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. We could hear people crying. Every Vietnamese house has a shelter of some kind. And down there was a family, probably 6 people, including a practically newborn baby. They were frightened stiff. They didn't want to come out. He coaxed them out. And then the house was torched.
You had an action like this before,
Marie? No, I haven't. Not like this, I have. Did you set fire to these houses here? No, we were just off to the left of it when it was burning.
Were you getting fire from them?
Somewhat, not too much. Just a little sniper fire.
The day's operation burned down 150 houses, wounded 3 women, killed 1 baby, wounded 1 Marine, and netted these 4 prisoners. 4 old men who could not answer questions put to them in English.
Camp Day was a shock. People saw American troops acting the way people had never seen before. And to see young GIs in big guys in flak jackets lighting up thatched roofs and women holding babies running away, wailing. This was a new sight, really, to everyone.
It went against the American myth of 1,000 Westerns in the movies. It is the Indians who are torturing women and children and the cavalry that rides up at the last minute to free them. And here was this jarring thing of our troops, instead of giving out chewing gum to kids, turning the firepower really on a village. It raised, in a very elemental way, the question of whether we were on the right side. What could be happening if our boys are doing this?
I think what makes the story in a certain way most significant was that it was happening on television, uncensored, either in picture or commentary. This wouldn't have happened in World War II, or if it had happened, it wouldn't have been photographed. Or had it been photographed, the photographs would have been censored or taken away. There was a realization that the rules have all changed.
Today's operation is the frustration of Vietnam in miniature. There is little doubt that American firepower can win a military victory here. But to a Vietnamese peasant whose home means a lifetime of backbreaking labor, it will take more than presidential promises to convince him that we are on his side. Morley Safer, CBS News, near the
You get a sense, the sense of the power of that. I want to mention an article Peter Brush has on his website, and I went to it today. He wrote, "Reaction to the Camp Nee report was immediate and powerful. CBS was inundated with calls and letters critical of the negative portrayal of American military personnel. Early in the morning after the film was shown, Frank Stanton, who's the president of CBS News, came out of his sleep to answer the telephone ring. 'Frank, are you trying to fuck me?' yelled a voice. 'Who is this?' asked the president of CBS News. Lyndon Johnson answered, 'Frank, this is your president. Yesterday your boys shat on the American flag.'" Johnson's recognition of what this would mean was tentative in one sense. He didn't realize, in the sense that trying to fight a limited war for limited objectives in a situation as complicated and messy as South Vietnam was not going to be a politically easy or manageable thing to do. And ultimately what would happen over time, and I'll stop. I've given you way more today, and I'll probably have to do my full-scale summary next week. But the basic argument that I would make is that, in effect, the United States, Johnson's gamble was that he could launch a war for limited objectives, ultimately getting some sort of bargain, preventing the collapse of South Vietnam on his watch, similar to what Truman had done in Korea, but without escalating to fighting the Chinese, without escalating to fighting the Soviets, and at the same time keeping his domestic programs intact, doing what Truman, of course, had lost control over and had been unable to do. Johnson hoped that. Technology, American opinion, the messy nature of the South Vietnamese experiment all would work against that. The United States would soon find itself in a stalemated war. Johnson would argue that he was making progress, and maybe I'll start next time with showing you how he made that argument. The Tet Offensive would ultimately undermine that, and in effect, the cracks already in the political support for the war would ultimately prevent and undermine the objective he had undertaken. It would, in a way, the Cam Knee incident, and I should add here, if any of you are looking for media bias, in fact, almost immediately after this, CBS did a whole series of very positive reports on the Marines and tried to make up in some sense. And actually, the Cam Knee report had real impact in terms of how military operations were conducted. And there were new orders about how to treat villagers and the rest. And the report also was somewhat selective. There had been significant enemy activity at Cam Knee. The enemy had simply withdrawn, but there was indeed a very large Viet Cong force in the area. All that said, the impact of that type of reporting would go on throughout the war, convincing people ultimately, especially after Tet, that this war was unwinnable and unworthy of the United States. And that would be the pressure ultimately Richard Nixon would face. I've got about 7 or 8 minutes for questions. I would imagine some of you have got them, and so, yes. Yeah.
It seemed like Johnson was also fighting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff
Yes.
in terms of
Yes.
Escalation, and that they were trying to get him to move forward faster.
Yes. Yeah. The military advice on the war was, as you're probably not surprising, they wanted to undertake much more dramatic military measures. In particular, intensifying the bombing of the North. Johnson was selective about targets early on. He set a limit in terms of the latitude for a time and then eventually moved it further north into attacking Hanoi and Haiphong. He was afraid, for example, in bombing the port of Haiphong that you would hit Russian ships, and so he was very cautious about that. The fears of an unlimited escalation were powerful ones, and he reacted against the military pressure. In a little bit of a way, I'm glad I played you the Curtis LeMay bit with President Kennedy a few weeks back. Just as LeMay had pushed Kennedy on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and even though Johnson wasn't there, he knew that that story was out there. There was this sense that the military was too eager and didn't understand the politics of the Cold War and was too thinking too narrowly about military victory. And what Johnson was about and what the war in Vietnam was about was not military victory. And this was a problem, to not put it this way. That the problem was that this had already immediate problems in terms of domestic support. Dean Rusk would later say that one of the things he learned is you can't fight a war in cold blood. And the Johnson administration's approach, which tried to fight this limited war, was in cold blood. It was not working up sort of patriotic enthusiasm or encouragement because of a fear that such a intensifying of the domestic attitude would encourage escalation. And this is something that's hard to capture in time, but at the time, most Americans thought he was on the right track. Most favored this sort of in-between approach. Gradually, that would change. And in fact, the collapse of Johnson's political support was not just from the doves who didn't want to be there, didn't believe in fighting the war, but it was also from hawks who said, if you're not going to win it, get out. And that was the dual thing that would ultimately destroy the consensus around the war and destroy Johnson's political future. Yes?
You have compared several times Johnson's thinking about the Cuban Missile Crisis and how it went, thinking perhaps South Korean,
right.
The Vietnam issue would be the same.
Right.
Is it perhaps that he totally misunderstood the thinking of Russians toward maybe European thinking and the thinking of Asians?
I think, without getting sort of essentialist about differences between sort of cultures and that, I think what's clear is that he ultimately misunderstood the degree to which the North Vietnamese were committed to the project of reunification, that government was willing to sacrifice and fight a total war on behalf of national unity that would accept casualty levels far and away what we would have accepted, and that, in effect, the thinking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was about superpowers dealing with nuclear arms and weighing this, had nothing to do with that type of war. You're right to say that. It's just that I would probably put it in terms that he did not grasp. Also, the other point I forgot is that Russia didn't control North Vietnam. You know, Russia did have some control over Cuba. We know now, actually, that Fidel Castro would have fired the nukes. We know that. I mean, he wanted nuclear war against the Americans at that time. I mean, or at least he said it. It's bizarre to read these things, but he actually said to Khrushchev at one point, you know, it'd be a sacrifice in the name of socialism, but we're worthy, you know, we want, you know, you think this is nuts. You know, Russia could control things. They had their men on the ground. They had that situation. They did not control North Vietnam. North Vietnam was, in that sense, able to play and act much more independently. And in that sense, Johnson misunderstood the degree to which the North Vietnamese were their own agents and capable of defying advice they might receive from the Soviet Union or China. Yes?
Why was the draft handled so stupidly? That was the stupidest thing that's been done. Any competent Roman general would have said, you do not send somebody over there knowing the date they're going to come back. And that totally destroyed.
But see, the whole point was that you did not want to fight a war for the duration because that would have produced political pressure to end it. And the only way to end it was through escalation or complete withdrawal. So you have a date for troops so that they know their war will be over. They've got a year, that's all. They come home. But it's the politics of it. It's the politics of the war that, of course, infuriate people who think in terms of, you might say, the military objectives and the rest, but has to be understood in the context of what Johnson thought he was pursuing in the Cold War and his domestic agenda. And I don't underestimate the degree to which he still was committed to his domestic objectives, because I think that did affect, for example, his unwillingness to impose a tax and some of the things he did. The draft was actually widely supported at the time. It's actually kind of a curiosity, given contemporary values and contemporary concerns, that most Americans supported the idea of a draft. It actually had more popular support than the war itself. So, yes?
If North Vietnam was so nationalistic as distinct from communistic, it seems that it undermines the domino theory.
Right.
And so the domino theory really wasn't correct to begin with.
The problem was, you're correct in one sense that their ultimate objective was more the reunification of Vietnam. The domino theory gets a bad name because sometimes it's seen very simplistically. But I think the way the Johnson people would have answered you at the time is that a communist success in Vietnam, even if it was only for the limited achievement of reunification, would have had reverberations because the United States had made a commitment. And the weakening of American commitments, and you could hear Johnson saying that, the weakening of commitments would have worldwide impact. And they did believe it. And as he says there in a sort of plaintive way, you know, all my best experts tell me that. And indeed, the consensus within the administration was powerful, and it existed in public opinion. We tend to confuse the degree to which there was opposition to the war at the time with the degree of consensus that existed for a time that Johnson was following the right course. We tend to think, well, everybody was opposed, or there was lots of people opposed. It wasn't. There were a lot of people who thought, well, he's doing, you know, even Robert Kennedy, who was critical, supported him in '65. People don't break until it doesn't seem to work. And, you know, the duration of the war, I think, is one of the key aspects. The fact it just kept going on and didn't seem to be producing any progress. I mean, I would take as a comparison what happened on Iraq. You know, when the Iraq War seemed to be over in a month, a lot of the people who had been disquieted about it moved on. The problem was it wasn't over, and mission wasn't accomplished. Johnson never gave a mission accomplished speech, but the idea, I don't think Americans thought that it was going to just continue and be ongoing And that was what ultimately would destroy the political support for it. We're hitting the witching hour. I'll come back. I promise I'll try to sum it all up next week. Thank you.